Millionaire's car broke down in the middle of nowhere. What the poor farmer did when he saw it all shocked the rich man. Mr. Anderson drummed his fingers on the steering wheel of his sleek, midnight blue Bentley Continental GT, a frown creasing his forehead. The GPS had led him astray, guiding him down a narrow, winding road that seemed to stretch endlessly through fields of golden wheat. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the businessman's darkening mood. He glanced at his Rolex watch, its diamond-studded face glinting in the fading light. "Darn it," he muttered under his breath. The board meeting was in less than 2 hours, and he was hopelessly lost in what appeared to be the middle of nowhere. At 45, Richard Anderson was the epitome of success. His tailored Italian suit hugged his athletic frame, and his salt and pepper hair was meticulously styled. He had clawed his way to the top of the corporate ladder, building a real estate empire that spanned across 3 continents. Time was money, and right now, he was wasting both. He reached for his smartphone, ready to call his assistant and have her reschedule the meeting, when a sputtering sound from the engine caught his attention. The Bentley lurched, coughed, and then went silent, coasting to a stop at the side of the dusty road. "No, no, no," Richard growled, turning the key in the ignition. The engine wheezed but refused to start. He slammed his palm against the steering wheel in frustration. Stepping out of the car, Richard loosened his silk tie and surveyed his surroundings. Fields stretched as far as the eye could see, broken only by the occasional cluster of trees or weathered fence post. The air was thick with the scent of earth and growing things, so different from the sterile, air-conditioned environment of his penthouse office. As he popped the hood of his car, pretending he knew what he was looking at, the sound of an approaching vehicle caught his attention. An old rusty pickup truck rumbled down the road, slowing as it neared the stranded Bentley. The truck came to a stop, and out stepped a man who looked to be in his early 50s. He wore faded overalls and a plaid shirt, his hands calloused and his face weathered by years of outdoor work. A John Deere cap sat atop his graying hair, and his blue eyes twinkled with curiosity as he approached. "Having some trouble there, friend?" the man called out, his voice friendly and tinged with a slight country drawl. Richard straightened, brushing imaginary dust from his suit jacket. "Yes, it appears so. The engine just died." The farmer nodded, peering under the hood. "Name's Tom Miller. Mind if I take a look?" Richard hesitated for a moment, unused to accepting help from strangers, especially those who looked like they could barely afford a tire on his Bentley. But desperation won out over pride. "Please, be my guest. I'm Richard Anderson." Tom's hands moved with surprising dexterity over the engine, checking various components with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime tinkering with machines. After a few minutes, he straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag he pulled from his pocket. "Well, Mr. Anderson, looks like your alternator's shot. Can't fix it here, I'm afraid, but I can tow you back to my farm if you'd like. Got some tools there that might help." Richard glanced at his watch again, realizing that the board meeting was now a lost cause. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I suppose I don't have much choice, do I? Thank you, Mr. Miller. I appreciate your help." As Tom hitched the Bentley to his truck, Richard made a few calls, rescheduling his meetings and informing his assistant of his predicament. He could almost hear her raised eyebrows through the phone as he explained that he was being towed to a farm by a kind stranger. As they set off down the road, the Bentley trailing behind like a fallen king, Richard found himself studying his unexpected savior. Tom's face was lined with wrinkles that spoke of both laughter and hardship, and there was a quiet dignity in the way he held himself. "So, Mr. Anderson," Tom said, breaking the silence, "what brings a fella like you out to these parts?" Richard chuckled ruefully. "A malfunctioning GPS and a series of poor decisions, apparently. I was on my way to an important meeting in the city." Tom nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Well, sometimes life has a way of taking us where we need to be, even if it's not where we thought we were going." As the truck rumbled down the road, the sun dipping below the horizon, Richard found himself pondering Tom's words. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to relax, to let go of the constant pressure of deadlines and deals. There was something oddly comforting about the rhythmic sound of the engine in the vast, open sky above. Little did Richard know, this unexpected detour was about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the farmyard, Tom and Richard stood back to admire their handiwork. The Bentley's engine purred softly, a far cry from its earlier sputtering demise. Richard wiped his brow, surprised to find himself covered in grease and grime, his expensive suit jacket discarded hours ago. "I can't thank you enough, Tom," Richard said, a newfound respect in his voice. "I never would have managed this on my own." Tom chuckled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Ah, it's nothing. Just glad we could get you back on the road." He glanced at the darkening sky. "Though it might be best if you stayed the night. It's getting late, and these country roads can be tricky after dark." Richard hesitated, his instinct to return to the familiar comforts of the city, warring with a strange desire to linger in this peaceful haven. Before he could respond, the screen door of the farmhouse swung open, and a woman's voice called out, "Tom? Dinner's ready." A warm-faced woman in her late 40s appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on an apron. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of Richard. "Oh, I didn't realize we had company." Tom waved her over. "Sarah, this here's Mr. Anderson. His car broke down on the road, and we've been fixing it up." He turned to Richard. "Mr. Anderson, this is my wife, Sarah." Sarah's face broke into a welcoming smile. "Well, you must be starving after all that work. Why don't you join us for dinner? I've made more than enough." Richard found himself nodding before he could think twice. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Miller. I'd be honored." As they made their way to the house, Richard noticed two teenagers peeking curiously from the window. Tom caught his glance and grinned. "That's our youngest, Emily and Michael. They're probably wondering what a fancy car like yours is doing in our driveway." Inside, the farmhouse was modest but immaculately kept. The dining room table was set with mismatched plates and simple cutlery, a far cry from the fine china Richard was accustomed to. Yet there was a warmth to the scene that tugged at something deep within him. Emily and Michael, both in their mid-teens, introduced themselves shyly. Richard couldn't help but notice the worn state of their clothes and the eager glint in their eyes as they took in his appearance. As they settled around the table, Sarah brought out a steaming pot of hearty stew and a loaf of freshly baked bread. The aroma made Richard's stomach growl, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since breakfast. "It's not much," Sarah said apologetically, "but it's filling." Richard took a bite and was surprised by the burst of flavors. "This is delicious, Mrs. Miller." "Thank you." As they ate, conversation flowed easily. Richard found himself captivated by the family's stories, tales of drought and bountiful harvests, of community barn raisings and local fairs. There was a richness to their lives that he had never considered before. Emily spoke animatedly about her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, while Michael shyly mentioned his passion for engineering. Richard couldn't help but notice the way Tom and Sarah exchanged a worried glance at the mention of their children's aspirations. "Those are wonderful goals," Richard said encouragingly. "Are you planning for college?" A heavy silence fell over the table. Tom cleared his throat. "Well, we're hoping to send them. Times have been tough lately, with the drought and all, but we're saving every penny we can." Richard felt a twinge in his chest. Here was a family who had opened their home to a stranger, sharing what little they had without hesitation. And yet, they struggled to provide opportunities for their children. Opportunities he took for granted. As the meal wound down, Richard found himself lingering at the table, reluctant to leave the warmth of this family circle. Tom regaled them with funny stories from his youth, his eyes twinkling as Sarah playfully swatted his arm, correcting his exaggerations. Later, as Richard prepared to retire to the guest room they had graciously offered, he overheard a hushed conversation between Tom and Sarah in the kitchen. "I don't know how we're going to make next month's payment, Tom," Sarah whispered, worry evident in her voice. "We'll figure it out, darling. We always do," Tom replied, his tone gentle but strained. Richard retreated quietly, his mind whirling. He thought of the millions in his bank account, of the properties he owned across the globe. And here was this family, kind and generous beyond measure, struggling to keep their farm and support their children's dreams. As he lay in the small, comfortable bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of crickets and distant livestock, Richard made a decision. He may have arrived at the Miller farm by accident, but perhaps there was a purpose to this encounter. Tomorrow he would find a way to help this family, not as a handout, but as a gesture of gratitude for the priceless lesson in humanity they had unknowingly given him. With that resolution, Richard drifted off to sleep, his dreams filled with golden wheat fields and the warm laughter of the Miller family. As the old pickup truck rumbled down the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust in its wake, Richard found himself oddly at ease. The rhythmic chugging of the engine and the gentle sway of the vehicle lulled him into a contemplative state. He glanced at Tom, whose weathered hands gripped the steering wheel with the confidence of someone who had driven these roads countless times. "So, Mr. Miller," Richard began, breaking the comfortable silence, "how long have you been farming out here?" Tom's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Call me Tom, please. And to answer your question, I've been working this land for nigh on 30 years now, inherited it from my father, who got it from his father before him." Richard nodded, impressed by the family legacy. "That's quite a history. It must be rewarding, carrying on the family tradition." "It has its ups and downs," Tom admitted, his tone tinged with a hint of weariness. "Farming ain't easy, especially these days. But there's something about watching things grow, providing for your family with your own two hands. It gets in your blood." As they talked, the landscape gradually changed. The endless fields gave way to a modest farmhouse, nestled among a cluster of weathered barns and outbuildings. A few chickens pecked at the ground near a rusty tractor, and in the distance, a small herd of cows grazed lazily. Tom pulled up in front of the house and cut the engine. "Well, here we are. Home sweet home." As they climbed out of the truck, the front door of the farmhouse swung open. A woman in her late 40s emerged, wiping her hands on a faded apron. Her face was kind, lined with the same mix of laughter and hardship that Richard had noticed in Tom's features. "Sarah, honey," Tom called out, "we've got ourselves a guest. This here's Mr. Anderson. His car broke down on the Old County Road." Sarah's eyes widened slightly at the sight of Richard in his expensive suit, but her welcoming smile never faltered. "Oh my, you must have had quite the afternoon. Come on in, both of you. I've got some lemonade cooling in the fridge." Richard followed them into the house, ducking slightly to avoid hitting his head on the low doorframe. The interior was modest but meticulously clean, with well-worn furniture that spoke of years of use and care. Family photos adorned the walls, telling a visual story of the Miller's life on the farm. As they settled around the kitchen table, Sarah poured tall glasses of lemonade. Richard took a sip, surprised by the perfect balance of tart and sweet. "This is delicious, Mrs. Miller." "Thank you." "Just Sarah, please," she insisted with a warm smile. "And it's the least I can do. Now, Tom, why don't you take a look at Mr. Anderson's car? See if we can't get him back on the road." Tom nodded, finishing his lemonade in one long gulp. "Right you are. Mr. Anderson, shall we?" As they headed back outside, Richard couldn't help but feel a twinge of embarrassment. Here he was, a successful businessman worth millions, and he couldn't even change a tire without help. Tom, on the other hand, moved with the confidence of someone who had fixed countless machines over the years. They popped the hood of the Bentley, and Tom let out a low whistle. "Well, this is a bit more complicated than our old John Deere, that's for sure. But let's see what we can do." For the next hour, Tom methodically checked various components of the engine, explaining each step to Richard as he went. Richard found himself fascinated realizing how little he knew about the inner workings of the machine he relied on daily. "Ah, here's our culprit," Tom announced, pointing to a part Richard couldn't identify. "Your alternator's shot. That's why the battery died on you." Richard's heart sank. "I don't suppose you have a spare alternator for a Bentley lying around?" Tom chuckled. "Afraid not, but I might be able to rig up something temporary to at least get you to the nearest town with a proper mechanic." As Tom worked, improvising with tools and spare parts from his workshop, Richard rolled up his sleeves and did his best to assist. His expensive suit was soon smeared with grease, but for once he didn't care. There was something oddly satisfying about working with his hands, about being part of the solution rather than simply throwing money at the problem. The sun was beginning to set by the time Tom stepped back, wiping his brow. "Well, it ain't pretty, but it should hold. Want to give it a try?" Richard slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, and then roared to life. A grin spread across his face, matching the one on Tom's. "You did it!" Richard exclaimed, feeling a rush of gratitude. "I can't thank you enough, Tom. How much do I owe you for your time and materials?" Tom waved him off. "Don't worry about it. Just glad I could help." As Richard opened his mouth to insist, Sarah's voice called from the porch. "Dinner's almost ready. Mr. Anderson, why don't you join us? It's getting late and those country roads can be tricky after dark." Richard hesitated, glancing at his watch. The board meeting was long past, and for once he found himself in no hurry to return to his usual world of deadlines and deals. "I'd be honored," he found himself saying, surprising even himself with the sincerity in his voice. As they walked back to the house, the aroma of home-cooked food wafting through the air, Richard felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Little did he know, this unexpected dinner was about to change his perspective in ways he could never have anticipated. The Miller family's dining room was a far cry from the upscale restaurants Richard frequented in the city. The wooden table was adorned with a simple checkered tablecloth, and mismatched plates were set out for each person. Yet there was a warmth to the scene that made Richard feel instantly at ease. As they settled around the table, Richard noticed two teenagers joining them. Tom introduced them as his children, Emily and Michael. Emily, the older of the two at 17, had her mother's kind eyes and a confident demeanor. Michael, 15, was lankier, with a shy smile and his father's weathered hands. Sarah brought out a steaming pot of hearty stew and a loaf of freshly baked bread. The aroma made Richard's stomach growl, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since breakfast. "It's not much," Sarah said apologetically, "but it's filling." Richard took a bite and was pleasantly surprised by the burst of flavors. "This is delicious, Sarah. Thank you." As they ate, the conversation flowed naturally. Richard found himself captivated by the family's stories, tales of community barn raisings, local fairs, and the challenges of farm life. There was a richness to their experiences that he had never considered before. Emily spoke animatedly about her dreams of becoming a veterinarian. "I've always loved animals," she explained, her eyes shining, "and there's such a need for vets in rural areas like ours." Michael, quieter than his sister, mentioned his interest in engineering. "I like figuring out how things work," he said, glancing at his father. "Maybe I could design better farming equipment someday." Richard couldn't help but notice the way Tom and Sarah exchanged a look at the mention of their children's aspirations. There was pride there, but also a hint of worry. "Those are wonderful goals," Richard said encouragingly. "Are you planning for college?" A brief silence fell over the table. Tom cleared his throat. "Well, we're hoping to send them. Times have been tough lately, with the drought and all, but we're saving every penny we can." Richard felt a twinge in his chest. Here was a family who had opened their home to a stranger, sharing what little they had without hesitation. And yet they struggled to provide opportunities for their children, opportunities he took for granted. As the meal progressed, Richard found himself sharing stories from his own life. Tales of board meetings gone awry and business deals struck in far-flung corners of the world. The Miller family listened with rapt attention, their eyes wide at glimpses of a life so different from their own. "Wow," Emily breathed. "You must have seen so much of the world, Mr. Anderson." Richard nodded, but suddenly his globe-trotting lifestyle seemed less impressive in the face of this family's simple, meaningful existence. "I have," he admitted, "but I'm not sure I've appreciated it as much as I should have." After dinner, as Sarah and Emily cleared the table, Tom invited Richard to join him on the porch. The night air was cool and crisp, filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. "Thank you again for your hospitality," Richard said, leaning against the porch railing. "I can't remember the last time I had a home-cooked meal like that." Tom nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Sometimes the simplest things are the best, aren't they?" They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, gazing out at the starry sky. Richard marveled at how many stars were visible here, away from the city lights. "You know," Tom said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about how much I charge for helping with your car." Richard turned to him, curious. "Yes? Well, I was wondering if maybe you'd be willing to do a trade of sorts." Tom's voice was hesitant but hopeful. "You see, Emily's been wanting to apply for this summer program at the state university, a kind of preview for aspiring vets. But the application process, well, it's a bit over our heads." Richard's interest was piqued. "What did you have in mind?" "I thought maybe you could take a look at her application, give her some pointers. Coming from someone like you, I reckon it'd make a real difference." Richard felt a warmth spread through his chest. Here was a chance to give something truly valuable. Not just money, but knowledge and guidance. "Tom, I'd be honored to help Emily with her application. And Michael too, if he's interested in any similar programs." The relief and gratitude on Tom's face were palpable. "That's mighty kind of you, Mr. Anderson. You have no idea what that means to us." As they shook hands, sealing their agreement, Richard realized something profound. In helping this family, he wasn't just repaying a debt for fixing his car. He was being offered a chance to make a real difference in someone's life, something his wealth alone could never accomplish. As he prepared for bed in the Millers' modest guest room, Richard found himself looking forward to the morning with an excitement he hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow, he would sit down with Emily and Michael, sharing his knowledge and experience. And in doing so, he suspected he might learn a thing or two himself about what really matters in life. The next morning, Richard woke to the sound of a rooster crowing and the gentle bustle of farm life outside his window. For a moment, he felt disoriented, the modest guest room a stark contrast to his luxurious penthouse. But as the events of the previous day came flooding back, a smile tugged at his lips. He dressed quickly, forgoing his usual suit for the more casual clothes Sarah had kindly washed for him overnight. As he made his way downstairs, the aroma of fresh coffee and bacon guided him to the kitchen. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," Sarah greeted him warmly, flipping pancakes on an old cast-iron skillet. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in years," Richard admitted, accepting a steaming mug of coffee from her. "And please, call me Richard." Tom entered from outside, the screen door banging shut behind him. "Morning, Richard. Thought I heard you stirring. How about a quick tour of the farm after breakfast?" Richard nodded eagerly, surprised by his own enthusiasm. As they ate, Emily and Michael joined them, both looking a mix of nervous and excited about the prospect of Richard's help with their academic aspirations. After breakfast, Tom led Richard around the farm. They walked through fields of wheat swaying gently in the morning breeze, past a small orchard heavy with ripening apples, and into a barn where a few cows lowed softly in their stalls. "It's not much," Tom said, a hint of pride in his voice despite his modest words. "But it's been in the family for generations. We've had our share of hard times, but somehow we always pull through." Richard listened intently as Tom explained the challenges they faced: unpredictable weather, fluctuating crop prices, the constant need for expensive equipment repairs. He began to understand the precarious balance that kept small farms like this one afloat. As they walked back towards the house, Richard's mind was whirling with ideas. He'd spent years acquiring businesses, maximizing profits, and expanding his empire. But now, faced with the Millers' struggles and their unwavering kindness, he felt a new kind of challenge stirring within him. Back at the house, Richard sat down with Emily and Michael at the kitchen table, scattered with college brochures and application forms. Emily's eyes shone with determination as she showed Richard her application essay for the veterinary summer program. "This is excellent work, Emily," Richard said, genuinely impressed by her passion and articulation. "Let's see how we can make it even stronger." For the next few hours, Richard guided Emily through refining her essay, offering insights on how to make her experiences stand out. He was struck by her intelligence and drive, recognizing in her the same ambition that had propelled him in his youth. Michael, initially quiet, began to open up as Richard turned his attention to him. The boy's interest in engineering was more than just a passing fancy. He showed a real aptitude for problem-solving and design. "You know," Richard said, an idea forming, "I have some contacts in the engineering department at State University. How would you like to sit in on a few classes this summer, get a feel for what it's really like?" Michael's eyes widened. "Really? That would be amazing." As they worked, Sarah bustled around them, refilling drinks and offering encouragement. Tom popped in and out, clearly trying not to hover, but unable to contain his pride in his children's enthusiasm. By late afternoon, Emily's essay was polished to perfection, and Michael had a clear plan for exploring his interest in engineering. The gratitude on their faces was worth more to Richard than any business deal he'd ever closed. As the day wound down, Richard found himself on the porch again with Tom, watching the sun set over the fields. "I can't thank you enough for what you've done for the kids today," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given them hope, you know? A chance at something we couldn't provide on our own." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "It's the least I could do, after all you've done for me. Your family has shown me more genuine kindness in the past day than I've experienced in years." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the evening breeze rustling through the nearby trees. "Tom," Richard said finally, "I've been thinking. I might have a proposition for you, a way I could help out around here a bit more permanently. Would you be open to discussing a kind of partnership?" Tom turned to him, surprise and a hint of wariness in his eyes. "What kind of partnership?" Richard smiled, feeling more excited than he had in years. "Well, it's just the beginnings of an idea, but I think it could benefit both of us. Why don't we sit down after dinner and talk it through?" As they headed back inside, the delicious smell of Sarah's cooking wafting through the air, Richard felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in a long time. He didn't know exactly how things would unfold, but he was certain of one thing. His accidental detour to this farm was turning out to be the most meaningful journey of his life. As the Miller family and Richard gathered around the dinner table once more, there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Sarah had outdone herself, preparing a hearty meal of roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and fresh vegetables from their garden. The aroma filled the room, but it was the promise of Richard's proposition that had everyone on edge. "So, Richard," Tom began as they settled into their seats, "you mentioned something about a partnership earlier?" Richard nodded, taking a sip of water to gather his thoughts. "Yes, I've been thinking about it all day. Your farm, your family, you've shown me something I've been missing in my life for a long time. Real connection, purpose, the satisfaction of hard work." Emily and Michael exchanged curious glances, while Sarah leaned in, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and caution. "I'm listening," Tom said, his voice steady, but his hands clasped tightly on the table. Richard took a deep breath. "I'd like to invest in your farm, Tom, not as a handout, but as a true partnership. I have capital that could help modernize your equipment, expand your operations, maybe even explore organic farming methods that could increase your profit margins." The family sat in stunned silence for a moment, Tom's brow furrowed. That's a mighty generous offer, Richard. But we can't accept charity. This farm's been in my family for generations, and it's not charity, Richard interrupted gently. I'm proposing a business deal. I'd provide the initial investment and we'd share in the profits. But more importantly, I'd learn from you about farming, about community, about what really matters in life. Sarah reached out and squeezed Tom's hand. It sounds like an opportunity, dear, one that could secure the kids' future. Emily's eyes were wide with excitement. Does this mean we could afford college without taking out loans? Richard nodded, smiling at her enthusiasm. That's certainly part of the plan. Your education, both of you, he said, including Michael with a nod, would be a priority. Michael, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. But Mr. Anderson, why would you want to invest in a small farm like ours? Surely there are more profitable ventures for someone like you. Richard was impressed by the young man's insight. You're right, Michael. On paper, there might be more lucrative investments, but I've realized that there's more to life than just accumulating wealth. This farm, your family, you have something special here, something I'd like to be a part of if you'll have me. Tom leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. It's a lot to take in, Richard. We'd need to discuss the details, make sure everyone's interests are protected. Of course, Richard agreed readily. I'll have my lawyers draw up a proposal, but I want you to have your own legal counsel look it over too. This needs to work for all of us. As they continued to discuss the potential partnership over dinner, Richard could see the wheels turning in Tom's mind. The initial wariness was gradually being replaced by cautious optimism. What about the day-to-day operations? Sarah asked. We've been running this farm our way for years. Richard held up his hands. I'm not here to take over or change everything. I want to learn from you, enhance what you're already doing. My business experience can help with marketing, distribution, maybe even exploring new crop options. But the heart of this farm, that stays with you. As the meal wound down, the conversation had shifted from the initial shock to excited planning. Emily was already talking about the veterinary courses she could take, while Michael was sketching ideas for farm equipment, improvements on a napkin. Tom stood up, extending his hand to Richard. We've got a lot to figure out, but I think we might have the beginnings of a partnership here, Richard. As they shook hands, Richard felt a warmth spread through his chest. This wasn't just a business deal, it was the start of something much more meaningful. Later that evening, as Richard prepared for bed in the guest room, he heard a soft knock at the door. It was Sarah holding a freshly laundered set of his clothes. I just wanted to say thank you, she said softly. Not just for the offer, but for seeing the value in what we do here. It means more than you know. Richard smiled, feeling a lump form in his throat. Thank you, Sarah. Your family has given me far more than I could ever repay. As Sarah bid him good night, Richard sat on the edge of the bed, looking out at the starry sky through the window. He thought about the life he'd left behind in the city, the endless meetings, the cutthroat deals, the hollow victories. Here in this modest farmhouse, he'd found something he didn't even know he was missing. Tomorrow would bring negotiations, paperwork, and the beginnings of a new chapter for both him and the Millers. But for now, Richard closed his eyes, feeling truly content for the first time in years. He'd come to this farm by accident, but he was staying by choice, and he couldn't wait to see what the future would bring. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity on the Miller farm. Richard had temporarily moved into the guest room, his designer suits replaced by comfortable jeans and work shirts. Each day brought new challenges and discoveries as he immersed himself in the rhythms of farm life. One sunny morning, Richard found himself in the barn with Tom, learning how to milk the cows. His hands were clumsy at first, unused to such manual labor, but Tom's patient guidance soon had him finding a rhythm. You're getting the hang of it, Tom chuckled, watching Richard's determined efforts. Never thought I'd see a big city businessman milking Bessie here. Richard grinned, wiping sweat from his brow. "Neither did I, Tom. But I have to say, there's something satisfying about it." As they worked, they discussed the progress of their partnership. Richard's lawyers had drawn up the paperwork, and the Millers' local attorney had reviewed it. Everything was proceeding smoothly, but there was still much to be done. "I've been thinking," Richard said, as they carried buckets of milk to the cooling tank, "we should consider investing in a small processing plant. It would allow us to bottle our own milk, maybe even make cheese. Cut out the middleman, increase our profits." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "That's not a bad idea. We've always talked about doing something like that, but never had the capital." Meanwhile, Sarah and Emily were in the farmhouse kitchen, experimenting with new recipes using the farm's produce. Richard had suggested they explore creating artisanal products to sell at farmers markets and local stores. "What do you think of this apple butter, Mr. Anderson?" Emily asked as Richard and Tom entered the kitchen. She held out a spoon of golden brown spread. Richard tasted it, his eyes widening in surprise. "This is delicious, Emily. We could definitely market this." Sarah beamed with pride. "We've been going through my grandmother's old recipe books. There's a wealth of ideas in here." As they sat around the kitchen table, enjoying fresh bread with Emily's apple butter, Michael burst in, his face flushed with excitement. "Dad, Mr. Anderson, I think I've figured out how to modify the irrigation system to use less water." He spread out a series of hand-drawn diagrams on the table. "See, if we implement these changes, we could reduce our water usage by almost 30%. Richard leaned in, impressed by the teenager's ingenuity. "This is excellent work, Michael. We should definitely look into implementing this." Tom ruffled his son's hair affectionately. "That's my boy, always thinking ahead." As the days passed, the farm began to transform. New equipment arrived, carefully selected to improve efficiency without disrupting the farm's character. Richard worked alongside Tom and the farmhands, learning the intricacies of planting, harvesting, and maintaining the land. One evening, as the sun was setting, Richard found himself walking through the orchard with Sarah. The apple trees were heavy with fruit, their branches bowing under the weight. "I never thought I'd say this," Richard mused, plucking a ripe apple from a low-hanging branch. "But I think I'm happier here than I ever was in my penthouse in the city." Sarah smiled warmly. "You've brought new life to this farm, Richard. We can't thank you enough for that." Richard shook his head. "No, Sarah. Your family has given me far more than I've given you. A sense of purpose, of belonging. I didn't even realize how much I was missing it." As they walked back to the farmhouse, they could see Tom and the kids on the porch, laughing over some shared joke. The scene filled Richard with a warmth he hadn't felt in years. Later that night, as Richard sat at the desk in his room, he penned a letter to his board of directors. He explained his extended absence in his new venture. It wasn't a resignation, not yet, but it was clear that his priorities had shifted. As he sealed the envelope, Richard felt a sense of lightness. He knew there would be raised eyebrows and questions from his colleagues in the city. But for the first time in his life, he was certain he was exactly where he needed to be. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Emily holding a steaming mug. "I thought you might like some chamomile tea, Mr. Anderson. Mom always says it helps you sleep better." Richard accepted the mug with a smile. "Thank you, Emily. And please, I think it's time you started calling me Richard." As Emily bid him goodnight, Richard sipped the soothing tea and gazed out the window at the starlit sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but he was ready to face them, not as a distant investor, but as part of the Miller family farm. As autumn painted the countryside in vibrant hues of red and gold, the Miller farm was bustling with activity. The partnership between Richard and the Millers had blossomed, bringing new life and energy to the old homestead. Today was a special day. The farm was hosting its first ever harvest festival, an idea Richard had proposed to showcase their new products and connect with the local community. Richard stood at the entrance to the newly renovated barn, now converted into a charming event space. Strings of twinkling lights hung from the rafters, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh hay and apple cider. He watched as Tom directed volunteers in setting up booths for local artisans and food vendors. "Nervous?" Sarah asked, appearing at his side with a basket of freshly baked pumpkin muffins. Richard chuckled, adjusting the plaid shirt he now wore comfortably. "A little. It's strange. I've given presentations to boardrooms full of cutthroat executives without breaking a sweat, but this feels different." Sarah patted his arm reassuringly. "That's because it matters more. This isn't just business, it's personal." As the first visitors began to arrive, Richard marveled at the transformation. The once quiet farm was now alive with laughter, music, and the excited chatter of families, exploring the various attractions. Children squealed with delight as they navigated the corn maze Michael had designed, while others lined up for hayrides around the property. Emily, looking professional in a new veterinary student jacket, manned a petting zoo with some of the gentler farm animals. Her eyes shone as she explained to wide-eyed children how to properly care for the animals. "She's a natural," Richard remarked to Tom, who beamed with fatherly pride. "That she is, and to think just a few months ago, we weren't sure how we'd manage to send her to vet school. Now look at her, already got an internship lined up for next summer." As the day progressed, Richard found himself drawn into conversations with locals, many of whom were curious about the changes at the Miller farm. He explained their new sustainable farming practices, the artisanal product line they were developing, and their plans for the future. "It's not just about profit," he found himself saying to a group of interested farmers. "It's about creating something sustainable, something that benefits the whole community." To his surprise, he realized he meant every word. The businessman in him was still present, but it was now tempered by a newfound appreciation for the land and the people who worked it. As the afternoon wore on, Richard made his way to the apple orchard, where Sarah and a group of volunteers were demonstrating how to make their now famous apple butter. The sweet aroma filled the air, drawing in curious visitors. "Would you like to give it a try, Mr. Anderson?" one of the local women asked, offering him a wooden spoon. Richard laughed. "I think I'll leave it to the experts. But please, call me Richard. Mr. Anderson was my father." The casual ease with which he interacted with the townspeople surprised him. Gone was the need to impress or intimidate. Here, he was simply Richard, a part of the community. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the festival, Tom gathered everyone for the main event, the lighting of the harvest bonfire. Richard stood with the Miller family as Tom struck a match, setting the carefully constructed pile of wood ablaze. The crowd cheered as the flames leapt skyward, casting flickering shadows across smiling faces. Richard felt a tug on his sleeve and looked down to see Michael. "We did it, Richard," the boy said, his eyes reflecting the dancing fire. "We really did it." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "Yes, we did, Michael. All of us, together." As the evening wound down and the last of the visitors departed, the Miller family and Richard sat around the dwindling bonfire, exhausted but content. "I'd say that was a roaring success," Tom said, raising a mug of hot cider and a toast. "Here's to many more," Sarah added, clinking her mug against his. Richard looked around at the faces illuminated by the firelight. Tom's weathered but kind features, Sarah's warm smile, Emily's determined gaze, and Michael's curious eyes. He realized with a start that he no longer thought of them as business partners or even friends. They were family. "You know," he said softly, "when my car broke down on that road months ago, I thought it was the worst luck. Now I realize it was the best thing that ever happened to me." As the stars came out overhead and the crackling fire cast its warm glow, Richard felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had come to this farm a wealthy man, but he was leaving it rich in ways he had never imagined possible. The Harvest Festival wasn't just a celebration of the farm's bounty. It was a testament to the power of connection, community, and finding purpose in the most unexpected places. As winter blanketed the Miller farm in a soft layer of snow, the changes brought about by Richard's partnership were more evident than ever. The old barn had been fully renovated into a state-of-the-art processing facility for their new line of artisanal dairy products. The farmhouse kitchen, once cramped and outdated, now boasted modern appliances that Sarah used to experiment with new recipes for their growing product line. On this crisp December morning, Richard stood on the porch, sipping a mug of hot coffee and watching his breath form small clouds in the frigid air. The past few months had been a whirlwind of activity, challenges, and triumphs. As he reflected on the journey, he heard the crunch of snow behind him. "Penny for your thoughts?" Tom asked, joining him on the porch. Richard smiled, offering Tom a spare mug of coffee. "Just thinking about how much has changed. It's hard to believe it's only been a few months since my car broke down on that road." Tom nodded, his eyes scanning the snow-covered fields. "You know, when you first proposed this partnership, I was skeptical. Thought maybe you were having some kind of midlife crisis." They both chuckled at that. "But now," Tom continued, his voice growing serious, "I can't imagine how we would have managed without you. The farm's thriving, the kids are on track for college, and for the first time in years, Sarah and I aren't lying awake at night worrying about bills." Richard felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the hot coffee. "I'm the one who should be thanking you, Tom. Your family has given me something I didn't even know I was missing." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of excited voices from inside. Emily burst onto the porch, waving an envelope. "It came! My acceptance letter to the veterinary program!" she exclaimed, her eyes shining with joy. Sarah appeared in the doorway, wiping happy tears from her eyes. "Our little girl, off to become a doctor," she said proudly. As they gathered around Emily to congratulate her, Michael emerged from the barn, his arms full of blueprints. "Richard, can I show you my latest idea for improving the irrigation system?" he asked eagerly. "I think I've found a way to make it even more efficient." Richard nodded, marveling at the young man's enthusiasm. "Of course, Michael. Let's take a look after breakfast." As they all headed inside for a celebratory meal, Richard couldn't help but reflect on the contrast between his life now and the one he'd left behind in the city. The endless meetings, the cutthroat deals, the hollow victories, they all seemed so distant now. Over a breakfast of fresh eggs, homemade bread, and Emily's famous apple butter, they discussed plans for the future. The farm's new product line was set to launch in stores across the state in the new year, and there was talk of expanding their organic farming practices to neighboring properties. "We've come a long way," Sarah remarked, refilling Richard's coffee cup. "But there's still so much to do." Richard nodded, his mind already racing with new ideas. "I was thinking we could look into solar panels for the barn roof. It would cut our energy costs and be good for the environment." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Solar panels? On a farm? Now that's something I never thought I'd hear." They all laughed, the sound of their joy filling the cozy kitchen. As the day progressed, Richard found himself in the barn with Michael, poring over his irrigation plans. The boy's intelligence and creativity never ceased to amaze him. "You know, Michael," Richard said, "with ideas like these, you could have a real future in agricultural engineering. Have you thought about which universities you might want to apply to?" Michael's eyes lit up. "Really? You think I could do that?" Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "I don't just think it, I know it, and I'll do whatever I can to help you get there." Later that evening, as the family gathered in the living room, the warmth of the fireplace keeping the winter chill at bay, Richard felt a sense of contentment wash over him. Emily was curled up in an armchair, nose deep in a veterinary textbook. Michael sat on the floor, sketching new ideas in his ever-present notebook. Tom and Sarah sat close together on the sofa, their hands intertwined, watching their children with pride. Richard realized that he no longer felt like a visitor or even a business partner. He was part of this family, part of this community. The wealth he'd accumulated over years in the corporate world seemed insignificant compared to the riches he'd found here: love, purpose, and a sense of belonging. As he gazed out the window at the moonlit, snow-covered fields, Richard knew that his journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, new obstacles to overcome. But for the first time in his life, he felt truly prepared to face whatever came his way. Because now, he wasn't facing it alone. The Miller farm had started as an unexpected detour in his life. Now, it was home. As spring blossomed once again on the Miller farm, bringing with it new life and renewed hope, Richard stood in the freshly tilled fields, watching as Tom guided the new tractor across the land. The farm had flourished beyond their wildest dreams, becoming a beacon of sustainable agriculture and community spirit. Emily, home from her first year of veterinary school, was in the barn, tending to a newborn calf with the confidence of a seasoned professional. Michael, accepted into a prestigious engineering program with a full scholarship, was fine-tuning his latest invention, a smart irrigation system that promised to revolutionize water conservation in farming. Sarah approached Richard, carrying a basket of their award-winning apple butter, now a staple in stores across the state. "Can you believe it's been a year since your car broke down on our road?" she asked, a warm smile on her face. Richard shook his head, marveling at how much had changed. "It feels like a lifetime ago," he replied. "I never could have imagined where that breakdown would lead." As they walked back to the farmhouse, now expanded to accommodate their growing business, Richard reflected on the journey. The farm's success had exceeded all expectations. But more importantly, it had brought healing and purpose to everyone involved. Inside, they found Tom examining some paperwork at the kitchen table. "Good news," he announced as they entered. "The organic certification came through. We're officially recognized as a fully organic farm." The family gathered around, celebrating this latest achievement. As they talked excitedly about future plans, Richard felt a profound sense of belonging. He had long since resigned from his position in the city, choosing instead to dedicate himself fully to the farm and the community that had embraced him. Later that evening, as the sun set over the fields, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange and pink, the Millers and Richard sat on the porch, enjoying the peaceful end to another busy day. "You know," Tom said, breaking the comfortable silence, "when you first offered to help us, I was worried we might lose the essence of what made this place special. But you didn't change us, Richard. You helped us grow in more ways than one." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "This farm, this family, you've given me more than I could ever repay. You've shown me what truly matters in life." As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Richard looked at the faces around him. Tom and Sarah, their love and determination having weathered every storm. Emily and Michael, their futures bright with promise. And he realized that his unexpected detour had led him exactly where he was meant to be. The broken-down car that had once seemed like a disaster had in fact been the beginning of the most meaningful journey of his life. Here, among the fields and the family he now called his own, Richard had found his true home. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.